I will begin with a bold contradiction. Empiricism is both the philosophy of our time and absolutely not the philosophy of our time. It's a philosophy of our time because it's everywhere. Think about the mentality of a bourgeois who is focused on his immediate interest or the short-term view of a shareholder. But there was a time where the ruling class had a broader vision of society and its interests. But in a period of decay, the horizon of the ruling class is becoming much narrower. We have seen it with the pandemic. They injected massive amounts of money into the economy because there was the urgent need to save the system. And then what they say, well, we'll deal with the consequences later. Don't focus about that. As they say, a man on the edge of a cliff doesn't think. But it's not just the ruling class who has this outlook. We've been asking a question recently. Why is the left so lame? And at roots, actually, the empiricist point of view explains much of the failure of the left. The reformist view of the working class is dictated by this very simplistic vision of certain apparent facts. Workers vote right-wing. They like Trump. Therefore, they're just a bunch of idiots, and there's nothing to do with them. Look at the NDP and Québec Solidaire. For them, it's quite simple. Right-wing parties win. Therefore, if you want to win, we don't have any choice. It's a fatality. We need to adapt to the capitalist establishment. What do we hear? We need to be realistic, or we are told. It's okay to dream, but we need to look at the facts. We need to be pragmatic, GND was very proud to be a pragmatic. And it's the same with union leaders who, when they sell out workers, for example, the government or the boss will say that, there's no money, we need to compromise, and then the union leaders, they come and they go talk to the workers and they say, well, that's the best we can do realistically, we have to compromise. And so this very fatalistic, complacent view of reality is really a form of empiricism. We also see not just the mainstream reformist union leaders and all, but also left-wing activists in the movement, who tell us that our ideas are unrealistic, unreasonable, or what we hear often is that we don't know what we're talking about because we are not connected to the reality on the ground like they are, We can't understand the working class because we are not directly and constantly in the factory. So, economicism, workerism, movementism, these are at roots, a very narrow form of, this formalistic focus on the immediate facts. So we see, I think, everywhere various forms of empiricism. But as I said, it's a philosophy completely inadequate for understanding the epoch we live in, and then therefore for transforming it. Why is that? Because things are changing. They are changing, as you said. I'm not going to sing, don't worry. They are, well, maybe tonight. They are constantly changing. Matter is in constant motion. But also, in this particular epoch, society has reached a state where development is accelerating. And so there is a lot of contradiction, a lot of various aspects, various factors that are interacting one another to create phenomena and the development of society. So without a holistic global vision that can dig beneath the surface of immediate appearances, that is, without a dialectical outlook, it is impossible to understand the world. So this morning's discussion is by no means a purely academic discussion. It goes at the very heart of Marxism. And so the question of how we can know the world is of prime importance for the revolutionary action. When we think about empiricism, we think about the fantasy world of Bishop Berkeley and of David Hume. Of course, we will get to that. But I think it's important to understand how English empiricism came into being. So we are in the 16th century. It's the Renaissance period, an incredible moment of philosophical, scientific, and cultural rebirth. Greek philosophy is being rediscovered, including the materialist world outlook that we had in Greece. We are looking again at nature without the filter of religious dogma. It's a context of the rise of capitalism. The productive forces were developing with the growth of new technologies. And this came with the development of the experimental method. The Englishman Francis Bacon was a pioneer in this regard at the end of the 16th century. And we'll see, like, about 30 years later, René Descartes will carry out a similar work in France. Bacon's thinking formed the basis that will influence the development of English empiricism, while Descartes influenced European rationalism. In general, we contrast rationalism and empiricism, rationalism based on deduction and empiricism on induction. But initially, before those schools of thought evolved, or I would say even degenerated, they came from a very similar materialist intuition. So Descartes believed in God, but he introduced a new conception of the world, of the physical world, in which God does not intervene after he created the world. So he is outside of the world. It's a very revolutionary idea. God retires at a very young age. Yeah, 7 days. Yeah, I mean, good life. Bacon also believed in God, but here again, God is absent in the equation, because Bacon sought a method that would enable man by himself to increase his power over nature. So both Bacon and Descartes, they believed in God, but it was as far as it went. And as Marx and Hegel put it, and I quote, "For materialism, deism is but an easygoing way of getting rid of religion." Now, since the time of the ancient Greeks, theoretical knowledge had been acquired exclusively through contemplation. But with Bacon, things will change completely. Bacon was really fascinated by the arrival of new technologies of his time, the printing press, the gunpowder, the compass, navigation techniques, and all. He was fascinated by their great usefulness to human life. Bacon said that science must look at the technical changes as a very good example. And science should aim to improve human life in a very concrete way. So now the goal of knowledge will clearly be to increase human power over nature. And Bacon said, and I quote, "In nature, the practical use of knowledge is not only beneficial to life, but also guarantees of truth." So in short, science must be proven in practice. This is a very profound revolutionary idea that we Marxists still believe in. Looking at the technical advances of his time, he also points out that he also talks about the essential role of what he calls collaboration of minds in bringing about process. So similarly in science, it's not the individual genius that should be important, but rather the collective work. Science will progress through its public and practical character, not by remaining individual and contemplative. So he drew inspiration from this to develop his experimental method, starting from empirical facts to arrive to generalizations. And this is a very good materialist intuition. And what we're going to see is that the early stages of English empiricism will greatly influence French materialist philosophers of the Enlightenment. And Marx and Engels, they explain this in the Holy Family in particular. They talk about the dual origin of French materialism. On one side, it comes from Descartes' physics, and on the other, from the English materialism. In particular, the empiricist John Locke will influence philosophers like Condillac and Helvetius in particular. And Marx explained that this English source of French materialism, and I quote, leads directly to socialism and communism. Why? Well, he says, if man draws all his knowledge, sensation, etc., from the world of the senses and the experience gained in it, then what has to be done is to arrange the empirical world in such a way that man experiences and becomes accustomed to what is truly human in it, and that he becomes aware of himself as a man. And then he continues, if man is shaped by environment, his environment must be made human. So you really see here how it leads to revolutionary conclusion. We need to change the world. So on the other side, Bacon will develop the inductive method, which is a way of studying things experimentally in which we proceed from a series of single facts to general proposition. But a strictly inductive method has important limitations, because no matter how many facts are examined, it only takes a single exception to undermine whatever general conclusion we have drawn from them. If you have seen, you probably have heard this before, if you have seen 1,000 white swans, you draw the conclusion that swans are white, and then you'll see, I think, I can remember which island there are black swans. You find one black swan, and then, boom, the whole conclusion doesn't exist. Everything crumbles. But the problem here is that by definition, particular and general are always opposed. Particular is not general, and general is not particular. That's the case. It's a contradiction of the material world. General phenomena cannot never be reduced to a particular fact, nor can they be contradicted by one. We see here in its infancy a weakness that will be transformed by the subsequent development of empiricism into a particular aversion to theory, the tendency towards narrow empiricism, as we say, the slavish worship of the facts, and the stubborn refusal to accept generalization. In contrast to this, the Marxist method is not limited to induction. Yes, everything starts with the analysis of facts in order to arrive to generalized conclusion. But it is then necessary to go from the general to the particular to understand the interaction of particular elements. So we also need deduction, because otherwise it leads to a very mechanical outlook where you never know if your general conclusion can explain a phenomenon as a whole. So induction and deduction are different aspects of the dialectical process of cognition, which are inseparably connected and condition one another. So the Baconian school of thought will exercise a contradictory influence on subsequent developments. So on the one hand, by stressing the need for observation and experiment, it really gave a stimulus to scientific investigation. But on the other hand, it gave rise to a narrow empiricist outlook, particularly in British philosophy. And also, it's very important here to remember that we are in the context of the development of the Newtonian science, the golden age of mechanicism, where we analyze things in their isolation. So it is very important to isolate, to analyze, to understand phenomenon, but we also need to reunite with the synthesis, because the whole is always greater than the sum of its parts. So the Marxist methods combines induction and deduction, but also analysis, you divide, and synthesis. So from the particular to the general, and from the general to the particular, and also from the division in isolated parts to the reuniting in the whole. So you see, after Bacon, Hobbes and Locke will emphasize this narrow view of empiricism. But even then, and I think it's important to not to see empiricism as this like monolithic block, because even then with Hobbes and Locke, they did not completely detach themselves from materialism. In fact, Hobbes was hated massively by the church. They saw this as the enemy who's going to bring atheism. And Locke, as I said, will have a very positive influence on the French materialism, which will prepare the ground intellectually for the Great Revolution of 1789. So this is the context in which empiricism was developing, enormous scientific advances, enormous progress. But there was also a contradiction emerging in society. So I mentioned Newton. So there was a new scientific orthodoxy that will develop based on the authority of Newton's thinking. There's a contradiction here. It's like you have this massive revolution in science, but eventually it's going to become sort of a dogma for scientists, and will eventually limit the scientific development for a long time. So with that, we will have a quite conservative way of thinking in the 17th century, particularly in England, obviously. And Hegel will refer to this worldview of he talk about the absolute immutability of nature. That's how the world will become to be with this outlook, this scientific and philosophical outlook. So this is on the development in science. But another big factor into this is the development of politics in England. So after the English Revolution and the so-called Glorious Revolution of 1688, the new ruling class doesn't want to hear anything that is associated with the revolutionary past. So the ruling class will only focus on narrow practical considerations, and look with distrust at theory, except what gives, direct practical results. So this is really in this context that we'll see the dead end of empiricism. So what we see here is that bourgeois philosophy shifts from progress to reaction. What yesterday served to reveal the truth against feudalism becomes a tool to expose the capitalist class, and so therefore it cannot be tolerated. So empiricism will fall in total idealism, the most reactionary kind there is. So that's when we are going to talk about Bishop Berkeley. He was at war with materialism. He attempted to prove that the material world did not exist. Berkeley's philosophy, like that of Hume, is really the expression of the reaction against the revolutionary storm of the previous period, which he identified with materialism as the root of atheism. So Berkeley starts with what Locke said. Locke said that nothing is in the intellect which was not first in sense. But Berkeley will push empiricism to its ultimate conclusion by saying that things can only exist insofar as they are perceived. And he will then coin the expression esse est percipi. So, excuse my Latin. It means to be is to be perceived. So this brings us really into the world of subjective idealism. Nothing exists that I do not perceive. So subjective idealism faces what is known as the famous problem of solipsism, the idea that we can be certain of nothing other than our own experience. Maybe you don't exist. Maybe there's only me who exists. By the way, it's a bit solipsistic in here? Or maybe it's just me. How do you give a solipsist an existential crisis? You tell me. Okay, Google it. There's plenty of jokes about that.
Cut that from the recording.
I'm doing an open mic tonight, so. So Bishop Berkeley solved this problem of solipsism with his friend God. So for him, it is the mind of God perceiving things that gives our ideas consistency and gives human beings a common point of reference. To put it simply, with Berkeley, it's a bit like if we are all in the Matrix. So nothing is, and we took the blue pill, obviously, nothing is real, and God is the architect who created the Matrix. If you don't know the reference, go watch the movie. Not the fourth one, it's not that good. But so, while with early empiricism, God was removed of the equation, as I mentioned, with Bacon. Now God is playing an integral part with Berkeley, playing the major role in this universe emptied of matter. So how does materialism respond to Berkeley? Well, Lenin had a few words in response to Berkeley because he debated with the contemporary version of Berkeleyism, with Ernst Mach neo-positivism, which made its way in Russia with empirical criticism. So even though these empiricists of Lenin's time claimed to be on the side of science, in the end, their entire philosophy led them to mysticism, like Berkeley. And interestingly, Lenin said that Berkeley was much more honest and frank than the empiricists of his time. He said, and I quote, "Frankly and bluntly did Bishop Berkeley argue. In our time, these very same thoughts on the economical elimination of matter from philosophy are enveloped in a much more artful form and confused by the use of a new terminology so that these thoughts may be taken by naive people for recent philosophy." I think we all know this. You know, we've seen this. This is the same thing we see today. Universities are full of new postmodern words to describe actually what is the same ideas of subjective idealism. The Russian empiricists of Lenin's time, they rejected materialism because they considered that posing a material world beyond our experience and sensation is a fantastical abstraction. It is inventing another world to which we have no access through our experience. It would be like introducing a metaphysical duality. That's what they say, that's what Bogdanov was saying. And they said the same thing, basically those philosophers, they said the same thing as Berkeley, that we cannot say that there is a real world outside of our sensation. And actually Berkeley also accused Locke of duplicating the world, to which we can respond, as Lenin said, but where do our sensations come from? Where do our senses come from? Where does our consciousness come from? Sorry. Where does our consciousness come from, which experience sensations through our senses? And if everything is experience, what are we experiencing? We must be experiencing something other than the experience itself. So, because experience, by definition, is a relation, you know? It's a relation between a subject and an object. So what are we experiencing? So, and Lenin will also go further. He says, if everything is experience, well, did the world exist before humans or any form of life existed and could observe the world? So this raised also the question, where did humans come from? Where did life come from? So to say that experience is the foundation of everything is ultimately to say nothing at all. It raises more questions than it gives answers. And this is why Lenin argues that this philosophy inevitably leads to religion, to mystical, irrational conclusion, because we have no explanation for nothing, so mysticism will fill this void. And Lenin summarized what is the materialistic perspective. He said, matter acting upon our sense organs produces sensation. Sensation depends on the brain, nerves, retina, etc., i.e., on matter organized in a definite way. The experience of matter does not depend on sensation. Matter is primary, sensation, thought, consciousness are the supreme product of matter organized in a particular way. So, it means that we have organic matter that arose naturally from inorganic matter. At some point, simple single-cell organisms evolved into more complex forms of life, and the subsequent development of a central nervous system will give rise to a brain, and ultimately to a human brain and human consciousness. So we are ultimately matter that has become conscious of itself. That's it. We don't need mystical explanation to understand our relationship with the world. The objective world exists independently of the subject experiencing it, but the two are part of a dialectical unity. So the subject experiencing the world is itself an object, insofar as humans are governed by the objective laws of nature and society. So the Marxist perspective is not dualistic. It's a monist philosophy. Everything is matter. That's what we stand for. And I think Lenin explained it very well. I really encourage you to read Materialism and Empirical Criticism. And I will come back to this later. So after Berkeley came David Hume, who took empiricism really to its logical conclusion. Personally, I don't think there's a more reactionary thinker than David Hume, not simply because he was a conservative, but with Hume, you can no longer know the world. You can no longer really talk about the world. We can no longer do anything, to be honest. It's really the final nail in the coffin of knowledge. Because, think about it, if, according to Berkeley, God gave us ideas, at least we knew where our ideas and sensation came from. But with Hume, we can not even go that far. For Hume, reality is only a series of impressions, the cause of which are unknown and unknowable. So it's really a throwback to the ideas of the Greek skeptics. Hume regarded the question of the existence and non-existence of the world to be an unsoluble problem. This is what we call agnosticism. This is a position that I see many times. You probably see this all the time. Agnostics views are everywhere. It's the idea that I cannot say that something exists because I haven't been presented with the proof that it cannot not exist, and vice versa. So I cannot say that something doesn't exist because I haven't been presented with the proof of its inexistence. For example, I don't have a proof that God doesn't exist. Therefore, I'll suspend my judgment. I cannot say if God exists or not. Another example that we hear often, I don't have any guarantee that the future socialist revolution in Canada will not lead to a dictatorship. Or another alternative, I don't have any guarantee that the RCI will not degenerate bureaucratically. Therefore, I will not place my full trust in the revolution or in the RCI. But as Ted Brent said, if you want a guarantee, buy a washing machine. The problem with this is that it is impossible to prove the inexistence of something. So no matter what we bring to prove that something exists or doesn't exist, you can always say that the opposite hasn't been proven wrong. When someone is a total skeptic, you've probably seen this. You can try to convince them. You bring all the facts. Every time they say something, they raise a doubt. Sometimes, like, you do contact work and you're very good. You're like, yeah, I mean, I brought all this example and all of this. But the more you bring proofs, the more you bring facts, the more the person stays completely skeptic and bring more doubt into the discussion. And at the end of the day, there's nothing to do because it's not about facts. And that's where really this empiricism, this skeptical approach leads you. At some point, there's nothing to do. Not always, by the way, but I think you get what I mean. So Hume also developed, well, the idea that I was already kind of like there with Berkeley, but he really theorized it. The idea that physical causality does not exist. We cannot say that a particular event causes another event, but we can just say that one event follows another one. So if you put your hand in the fire, you cannot say that fire causes the burning of your hand. It's just because we are accustomed to seeing this that we think that there is a causality between the fire and the burning. But maybe tomorrow, before going to the CC, you can try it. You put your hand in a fire, and maybe nothing will happen. I'm not fabricating anything here, so I'm going to quote Hume. He says, all our reasonings concerning causes and effects are derived from nothing but custom, and that belief is more properly an act of the sensitive than of the cognitive part of our natures. In other words, rationality is being replaced by belief. It's just a question of perspective, you know? There is no objective truth. You're just accustomed to this. It's in your mind. So actually, this is really the logical conclusion of the narrow outlook of empiricism. Because if you stick to the facts only, how can you see a connection between a cause and an effect? This doesn't appear in the fact. There's no link between one thing and another. You don't see it. So therefore, you cannot go beyond the fact. So it also means that time is not of the essence. Stop seeing a connection between each moment in time. So moments A happens, then moments B happens, but there's no connection between them. Everything is isolated. Maybe you're like, what is that? This is very childish, very irrational, ridiculous. But actually, this is something you see. You see this kind of reasoning today. You see people on the left doing the same time again and again, the same mistakes again and again, and they expect different results. Look at Zoran Mamdani running for the Democrats. We've been there before, not once, but twice with Sanders. But for some people, you know, for DSA folks and all, it's as if it never happened. There was no past. No past, no history, and we don't think about what will likely happen in the future. Only what is in front of us exists, and nothing else. The funny thing is I saw our next comrade was complaining that the RCI cannot help it but make a critical analysis of this, you know, based on the past experience and try to predict the future. But you see, there's sometimes this tendency of like just looking at what's in front of us and avoid seeing connections between the past, present, and the future. No causality here. Going back to Hume, If there's no causality, it means that we cannot make any prediction about the future because there is no necessity, no determinism. As Hume says it, necessity is something that exists in the mind, not in the objects. So if there's no necessity, it means that anything is possible. And this is where you can see there's a mind trick that we see often with this mindset, is to confuse real potential with abstract possibility. For example, is it possible that next week Donald Trump will install a military dictatorship in the USA? Well, in the abstract, nothing is impossible. But there is absolutely no real potential for that. So it shouldn't be in the equation. We shouldn't talk about this in our perspective. The only reason, actually, why you would mention this, you want to talk about this, about that abstract possibility, is if you think that it's actually a probability that it's going to happen. And so it's where we often see people disguising their real position. You know, someone brings up a possibility to divert attention from the most likely scenario, to bring doubts. Conspiracy theorists are very good at this. You know, they say, "Oh, I'm not saying anything. I'm just asking a question." You know, and that's really something you see. You see this sometimes discussed with people, and they bring this possibility. What if? What that? But it's like it's not connected to the real potentiality of the material world. To summarize here, with Hume, empiricism becomes the philosophy of the doubt, not the healthy critical doubt, but the absolute doubt. So there's no objective truth. It's a completely useless and applicable philosophy. It's really the philosophy of the petty bourgeois dilettantes or the psychotic folks. Now, let's move on to Kant. So, and you'll see why I'm mentioning Kant. So Kant will adopt Hume's doubt, even though he does not question the reality of the world. So Kant was not an empiricist per se, but he was also not a rationalist per se, but he is also both, but he will in the end fail to reunite them. Kant tells us that, yes, there's a world outside us, but you cannot know it. Why? We cannot know the thing in itself, that is the object of the world in their essence. So why we cannot know the world? Because we always analyze the world according to our categories that are a priori in our minds, particularly the categories of time and space. So for Kant, we can only know phenomena, the appearance of things, meaning that we can only know our own experience of the world, not the world itself. Maybe you think that it's a bit crazy. I hear sometimes Kant, mocking Kant. But actually Kant was a genius mind. And there was one thing that he points out that is really true and that Hegel will preserve. It's the fact that our experience of the world is mediated by our reasoning. So our reason is active in the process. As Hegel will say, facts do not select themselves. To perceive the particular, we always start with general concept. I can distinguish one singular fact from another because I can distinguish their general components. You cannot study the particular without the power of abstraction. As Spinoza said, all determination is negation. The mind is completely involved in the particular knowledge in order to separate, divide, and dissect. So if you follow the logic of empiricists who want to limit our knowledge to what is immediately given to us, you are forced to admit that nothing is simply given to us. We always make choice, our minds select. But where Kant is wrong is that consciousness, human reason, is not a barrier, is not a wall preventing us from knowing the world. On the contrary, it is a bridge to knowledge. And this is what Hegel will respond to Kant and will really explain. Knowledge is a process that does not end with the sensory perception, but rather begins with it. Imagine where we would be today if science had stopped as what is immediately in front of us. We would all be flat earthers. You see the round surface? No. So Hegel said that yes, we experience the world through our general categories or abstractions, but our categories are not simply the arbitrary product of human beings. Thanks to the category of mathematics, for example, you can count, you can divide, you can distinguish quantities in experience. But where does mathematics come from? Well, it's not purely an abstraction from out of nowhere. It's not arbitrary. Well, why do we use the decimal system? Because we count on our fingers. Ultimately, it's really derived from the world itself. So we from the world, from the practical world, we make generalization, and those generalizations, those abstractions, when they are established, they constitute a very, very powerful tool to understand the world, and it's really an indispensable instrument for the advance of science. So Hegel will succeed in overcoming the impasse of Kant's philosophy. But that being said, I mean, you know that the story is not going to end here. Hegel did not base his thinking on the real concrete thought, but he started from an abstract, an idealistic abstraction. So, in reality, we do not think with our pure mind. We think with all our senses, actually with all our bodies. We are all involved in the process. And this is really where Marx and Hegel will put Hegelian dialectic on his feet. Because what connects the human human to the outside world, or what connects human to the thing in itself, is not the abstract thought, but it's human labor, which transform natures and at the same time transform humans themselves. And this is what Marx explained in the second thesis of Feuerbach, one of my favorite. The question whether objective truth can be attributed to human thinking is not a question of theory, but a practical question. Man proved the truth, i.e. the reality and power, the decidedness of his thinking in practice. The dispute over the reality or non-reality of thinking that is isolated from practice is a purely scholastic question. It's very powerful. It is through practice that we can truly test the validity of general theories and adjust or correct them if necessary. And I don't know if you see it here, but in a way, we are going back to the beginnings of empiricism, but on a higher level. When developing the experimental method, Bacon already said that science should not become a mere collage. I like this word, collage, French. English use weird French word. It's not the mere collage of empirical data. To establish a true science that can advance humanity, he said that science must stop to be contemplative. And this is what we have here. To understand nature, human rationality must intervene to test nature. It's in the practical world that we can really understand. And when we talk about practical activity, it also means that knowledge is a collective effort. It's not my own limited individual experience, but about humanity's experience. It's that passes through ages. And this applies to Marxist science and theory. We are very lucky to follow a long line of Marxists who have passed on knowledge and lessons that we can learn from in order to act more effectively today. And so, as Trotsky would say, that theory is ultimately the generalization of human practice. And to borrow the terminology that Hegel used in response to Kant, the entire history of science and human thought in general is the process of transforming the thing in itself into the thing for us. And so, in other words, we cannot know what we cannot know at a given stage of scientific development will be eventually explored and explained. The barriers are broken down the road. So I think the conclusion here for that is that the entire process of scientific evolution is the proof and the truth, is the proof of the truth and superiority of dialectical materialism over empiricism. And Marxist philosophy is really the culmination of the bourgeois revolutionary philosophy. That is what we have here. But as capitalism entered in its declining phase, capitalism will hold on increasingly to obscurantism, subjectivism, and all forms of idealism. And this will come with a fierce attack on materialism and dialectical thinking. Empiricism has really exerted a big influence on modern bourgeois philosophy and science in various forms. So in 1908, Lenin wrote Materialism and Empirical Criticism, and he engaged in an important ideological struggle against the ideas of Bogdanov, Lunacharsky, and others leading figures in the Bolshevik Party, actually. So they essentially wanted to revive the old ideas of Berkeley, but obviously these ideas did not come from nowhere. So what we saw in Russia is that the defeat, the counter-revolutionary process, actually, after the 1905 revolution, will spread to the realm of philosophy, the realm of ideas. As we have seen many times in history, the petty bourgeoisie, in particular the intellectuals, very quickly will fall into pessimism and reactionary ideas following revolutionary defeats. In fact, as an intermediary layer between the working class and the bourgeoisie, the petty bourgeoisie constitute an organically unstable layer or class, constantly wavering between the two major classes. And so when the working class moves in a revolutionary direction, we can see some petty bourgeois intellectual entering into a state of ecstatic enthusiasm. But this very quickly turned into its opposite, because their sudden confidence in the working class will fade just as quickly when the defeat comes. And so what we see then is that the petty bourgeois intellectual will cave to reactionary pressure, and they will move to the right. So the struggle for social and collective ideas will quickly be replaced by individualism and subjective idealism. And this is what we will see in Russia, but also that's what we're going to see after the revolutions in the 60s and the 70s, which led actually to the rise of postmodernism. That's really what we will see. Subjectivism really represent the individualistic point of view of the petty bourgeois intellectuals, preoccupied, with their careers, with their own emotion, own experience. If the world doesn't match my desires, well, surely the world is the problem, not me. It is better to retreat in your own subjectivity and even to reject the existence of material world. I'm mentioning this, and here there's also one thing important is the connection between formal logic and empiricism. And I'm going to give the example of Bogdanov. It's not a coincidence that the Bolshevik Bogdanov fell both into empiricism and ultra-leftism. Think about it, if nothing exists except the sensations we perceive, on what do we base our analysis of the world? Well, there's not much, actually. So what it remains is your own ego and your preconceived ideas. So Bogdanov will therefore seek to impose his formal vision of things on the real movement in 1905, and this will lead to a disaster. Another example, well, it's the year of Ted Grant. We're talking a lot about Ted Grant in the Fourth International. Well, we have the same problem here. The leaders of the Fourth, they had an idealized version of Trotsky's prediction, complete formalism, and then they will eventually make a 180 degrees turn towards a crude empiricism, and with a narrow focus on the post-war boom. And so they will go from ultra-leftism to opportunism, and both at the same time, while being complete prisoners of abstract formulas. They will also play ping-pong with the facts, making empirical zigzags. So why I am mentioning all of this is that you really see here the connection between philosophy and politics. A bad philosophical method will lead you to bad politics, or in this case, political disaster. I think it cannot be repeated enough that no concession can be made to philosophical idealism, no concession to alien class ideas. If Lenin had not fought for political clarity in the Bolshevik Party, it is highly doubtful that the party would have been able to play the role it did later on. And if you look at the history of the degeneration of the Fourth International, if Ted Grant had not fought to keep the Marxist ideas and method intact, our international would maybe not exist today, or maybe it would not be in the same state that we see today. So really, this is a struggle that we must carry on, that we must carry against idealism today, particularly, against postmodernism, which is the most common form of empiricism we see now. So we must protect our organization from the bourgeois ideas that dominate society. But I'm saying this. This is something we repeat often. We have discussed a lot about the struggle against alien class ideas. But I think it doesn't mean that we fully understand or that we fully integrate the Marxist method. We can have a theoretical discussion, about empiricism, a reading group or something, about postmodernism. So everybody understands, everybody agree. These ideas are reactionary, and we should not fall for that. But it doesn't mean we are immune to this philosophy. Why? Because, you have a meeting, and then, okay, meeting ends, we all go back home. And then life happens. You go home, you have your daily routine that takes over, and there are all sorts of pressure to fall for subjectivism, empiricism, everywhere. There is the social pressures, your environment, close environment, your family. You have just the mainstream politics that are exerting a pressure. There's the financial pressure as well. You watch TikTok videos. You fall into the echo chamber of social media. And you can also, you read the news and all of this, and it's like the routine takes in, and you don't ask questions. You read the media routinistically, passively, and you don't question it, without a critical eye. The fact is that everything in our lives pushes us, I think, to narrow our scope, to narrow our vision, to focus on what is immediately in front of us, to retreat into subjectivism. And if we don't become aware of that, and if we don't actively seek to raise our heads, to have this long view, this long Marxist view of history, empiricism will actually dominate us. So empiricism is really, I think, the easy path, the de facto path in society in many cases. But Marxism is really the difficult one, the difficult road, because it requires rigorous study of ideas, but also, and above all, it requires a personal discipline, I think, to keep your head above water, to actually seek to understand the social processes beneath the surface of things. And there is no recipe for that. Of course, education is the key. Of course, education is the key. But then it must be an active education where we challenge our preconceived ideas, your own preconceived ideas. Yes, we must read, but we often spend, but also we should spend more time sometimes thinking about what we are reading, not just grabbing stuff like that. So we cannot take a routinistic approach to ideas. Sometimes we can fall into routine, but we always need to remind ourselves that we should raise above that. And so to gain a superior understanding of the world and society, it really takes a lot of work. As I said, knowledge is an active process of the mind. So this fully applies to Marxism. It's hard, it's a long process. But as Marx said, and I will end on this, there is no royal road to science, and only those who do not dread the fatiguing climb of its steep paths have a chance of gaining its luminous summits. Thank you.